Okay, so looking at intergroup relationships, having multiple groups that regularly interact with the idea of cooperating, has two important effects on the groups themselves, on individuals who are members of those groups. One is to provide greater levels of organization. And so in this sense, the higher the height of the curve, or the Gaussian distribution, really refers to the level of organization. More members refers to a larger organization. In the ways that we often think about political organization, smaller organizations can be a family. That could be one of the smallest units of social organization. Extended family is a little bit larger. You get beyond the family, you can get to a clan or a tribe, increasingly larger group size with more members. In terms of secular organization, we can talk about towns as being a smaller order of organization, counties being larger, states being larger, federal states being even larger, and even global organization of states can be an even larger level of aggregation. And so we have various levels of group organization, various sizes, and the only way we can reach these larger groups and have them actually persist over time is that they actually have to incorporate and be compatible with smaller levels of groups. That individuals at the beginning of the societal development process can't leap to global organization. And so we see the history of human civilization as a progression in the size of the social groups, in the associations amongst groups, in the complexity of group associations. And so what we're really dealing with is not only the systemic quality of social organization as we get multiple groups, and so we have to contend not only with relationships amongst individual members of groups, but also the aggregate relationships between groups, or the members of groups with other members of the group or other groups. And so you can see that things can get extremely complex. So normally, at these higher levels of organization, the only way they can maintain association with smaller order groups and keep them in cooperative relationships, in exchange relationships, is through the conflict management function and also through the socialization function. The higher order groups have to basically have sets of principles and rules sets to help members of other organizations comply with a general set of rules that are really applicable and compatible with the interests of a large number of divergent interests and group organizations. So the most simple way to represent this is to have a small number of groups that are interacting regularly. And in this case, we have the model that I have displayed behind me. This is a simple societal system. It has two levels of group organization. It has two similar groups. They don't have to be similar. There's no relationship between the size of smaller order groups. In this case, it's done just to simplify the model, to add more groups to the model without increasing the complexity and thereby increasing the difficulty of explanation. So we have two similar groups, and the only way they can associate between themselves is to form a higher order association. And that's what this larger curve represents. This is a group that actually forms the basis of the association between these two groups that have common purpose, have common cause, have common goals, who have chosen through the actions of their societal elites, the proto-state, to integrate politically and form a lasting, a new level of organization. This, what I would call then a superordinate political association or social group. As we see in this diagram, these groups are in cooperation. You can call this harmony. They have a harmonization or homogenization of key interests and common strategy for pursuing these interests, and so they line up on a common social norm and a set of rules for interacting on a regular basis. Contrasting to this, then, we can see that these groups can lapse into a conflict relationship. And conflict really pushes these groups away from the central norm, the central tendency, in the superordinate group sense, and the contention contrasts with cooperation. Now, when it goes into contention, as they separate from the norm, it's really the responsibility, the conflict management function of the superordinate group to come up with a resolution to this conflict and bring these groups into harmony and acceptance of a cooperative norm. So the articulation of compromise, cooperation, a resolution to the conflict is a constant function of a superordinate group. If it does this successfully, when new conflicts arise because of a change in circumstance, a change in ways of doing things because new inputs are put in, or there's a stress from outside the group that causes a change in values amongst group members, these conflicts have to be articulated between the groups through this superordinate group. The superordinate group then has to come up with a common solution that will satisfy or accommodate the interests of these conflictual group norms, and then draw these groups back into a common purpose. So, to summarize the simple model of societal system dynamics with a three-group political scenario, we see the time being an extremely important factor. When we bring time in, and within a given perceived political space where two groups have common cause and see a common need or desire or a vision of working together regularly and forming a larger association and imbuing in that larger association responsibility to manage conflict between the group interests of these two separate groups who are separated mainly in circumstantial space, meaning that they have different interests or different experiences, a different background, but they recognize common purpose, common cause, common interests that stand at the same time as they also recognize that they have some differences. This superordinate group then is charged with socialization and conflict management functions to keep this system vibrant, salient, to help it endure and persist over time. So, over time and within a given political space, the social learning that results from repeated interactions among social groups will create an institutional, procedural, and processual regularities that increase the densities of cooperative interactions, linkages, and associations amongst the social actors, and thereby increase system resilience and persistence through effective conflict management, that is, reducing contention and coercion, and increasing political integration, shared interests, and increased efforts to maintain the system. So the groups over time recognize a greater stake in maintaining the larger system and the larger association. But as we've seen through the study of the behavior of social groups, these lower order groups tend to persist over time despite the emergence of a higher order association. And that this is not necessarily a threat to the larger order association. This is actually a form of resilience, that these groups recognize their differences, can act and interact according to these differences within the lower order group. But their commonalities, they shift the management and the development and the cooperative arrangements for the pursuit of these common interests to this higher order association. And so these now three groups exist in a cooperative scheme, a systemic scheme that is complementary, supplementary, and actually not only helps to maintain the higher order organization, but because it deals with the common interests of the groups and makes the pursuit of these common goals more efficient and effective, actually allows the lower order groups more time to focus on their specific and their special interests. And as long as these are all compatible, they exist in a cooperative scheme. As incompatibilities are recognized, they tend to move into a conflict posture, thereby, of course, initiating a conflict management function within the higher order group to try and come up with a social norm that, if not incorporates or accommodates these differences, at least sets up a situation where it allows these differences to persist without creating conflict amongst groups with different interests. And so the complexity of this scheme is an integral part of systemic dynamics, and making the dynamics line up and to emphasize cooperative schemes over instrumental or coercive schemes is extremely important function of the societal system. The different levels of organization, of course, continue to multiplicate as a function of development. And so we start to see the emergence of a natural form of subsidiarity, that as groups form and as they persist over time, as they find complementary ways of pursuing specialized interests, they tend to focus special interest management within the lesser group organization. They have then the authority over their special interests, as long as those special interests are pursued in ways that are complementary to the pursuit of special interests by other associative social groups. And so this subsidiary arrangement is extremely important because it reduces the amount of complexity that higher order organizations have to contend with. If special interests are managed and the conflicts that arise through the pursuit of special interests amongst group members in lower level organizations and social groupings, if that's managed properly within those groups, and only those activities, interests, and functions that actually are shared across groups are necessarily managed by the higher order group, that reduces the complexity that the higher order groups manage. Over-centralization of authority really overwhelms the higher order groups with the levels of complexity that really work against its ability to manage these emerging conflicts. That micro-management tends to diminish the resources necessary to maintain the group and the group's viability, because conflict management function is highly consumptive. It's economically inefficient because resources are taken from group effort, and instead of moving those resources to increase or improve societal or systemic development, they are utilized basically to create conditions necessary in order for societal and systemic development to occur. So we see the two main intergroup functions displayed in this diagram. One, the conflict management function, which multiple group norms have to be articulated on the basis of commonality, and these commonalities codified and managed and maintained through neutral coercion, emphasis on cooperation. And over time, as groups learn to integrate, the circumstantial differences amongst groups tends to minimize, and they start to draw nearer to the shared norms of the larger group. And so we see an assimilation function over time, which minimizes the diversity within the group, but doesn't negate it or get rid of it completely. And so diversity is still important for resilience, but over time, the adoption of best practices amongst multiple groups that form associations into societal systems starts to diminish as they start sharing more values. Okay, just as a way to illustrate the increasing complexity of societal systems as they learn over time, as they form more institutionalized relationships, more institutionalized ways of doing things, procedures, greater commonality of approaches. This is done as a function not only of each group learning how to cooperate amongst members of the group, but also learning how to create or facilitate cooperation amongst the groups comprising the system and amongst members of multiple groups within the system. So the complexity increases enormously, and it's very difficult to convey in simple diagrams. One way to convey this increasing complexity is to add a diagram with more and more groups, and we see this in the diagram displayed on the screen here. We've added a large number of groups at differing levels of organization. All of these groups have reached a common understanding of cooperative norms of not only intra-member interaction, but also intergroup interaction. And so we can call this a harmonious societal system model. Of course, this is a snapshot in time that harmony may be possible within complex societal systems, but it's usually short-lived because circumstances change continually. And so we're going to see a lot of vibration or movement amongst groups as they come in and out of interaction. But as long as the interaction and the conflictual interactions remain at a reasonable level, these can be managed and articulated over time, so they remain minimal. and it's extremely important for the different levels of administrative capacity to make sure these emerging conflicts are managed before they become counterproductive or they start to disrupt the normal flow of inter-member and intergroup interactions. So as we deal with higher levels of complexity, of course, it's much more difficult to talk in systematic ways about this complexity. So this is as complex of a model as I'm going to use in this discussion, but it does contain the essence of complexity in societal systems. It's nowhere near the level of complexity that we're dealing with. But even at this level of complexity, I think it gives the individual who is trying to understand societal systems a sense of just how difficult the conflict management and socialization function is, and how difficult it is to move from simpler forms or lesser levels of development to higher forms or higher levels of development. That these levels of and layers of complexity really develop over time. Groups emerge, groups disappear according to their salience, their performance. Groups that are effective persist over time. As they persist over time, they engage in regularized interactions with other groups. As they engage in regularized interactions, they face a wider array and variety of possible conflictual issues. They are able to innovate, adapt, or engage in entrepreneurial responses to these conflicts to come to a resolution and a codification of new social norms. And this is an extremely, in itself, a complex process. But the one thing that is important in this process is that as we learn over time, institutions become extremely important to the maintenance of these complex societal systems. That changes in these institutions have to be done very carefully. That the emergence of new conflicts has to be dealt with very quickly and very creatively. And this all leads to further explanation or justification on why democracy is a superior form of governance. Democracy not only emphasizes non-conflictual behaviors and interactions amongst group members and interactions between groups that constitute a interactive political space, but it also recognizes that communication and association are extremely important in the learning process itself or in the application of learning to circumstantial situations. And so it needs this constant communication amongst social groups and to decentralize authority so that the complexities can be dealt with at the appropriate level of organization. And in doing so, minimize the complexity that has to be dealt with at any one level so that the energies of that particular level can be focused on what's appropriate to their expertise and their capabilities. And so this constant communication, the emergence of conflict, the communication of those emerging conflicts to group members, the recognition that these conflicts can't be dealt with at a certain level of organization, and so the transferal of these or the referral of these emerging conflicts to higher levels of organization that can recognize common positions or have the capabilities to deal with the conflict and to help find cooperative schemes to keep groups into a cooperative mode of interaction extremely important. So this model then behind me presents a contrast, and it's a contrast that's really looks at what can happen when a system goes out of array, completely out of array. You can see that the groups, if there's too much conflict in a group, it can overwhelm the system. Nobody knows who's responsible for dealing with what particular conflict. Everyone becomes confused. And this is the basis for what we'll later discuss as a condition of polar factionalization. That if too many issues are in contention at any point in time, it overwhelms the capabilities of the conflict management function of the system itself. Whereas the system could resolve conflicts individually, if it's faced with too many conflicts simultaneously, it really presents a level of complexity that systems have a great deal of difficulty managing, especially within a short period of time. Given a long enough period of time, they may be able to resolve complex factors. But if they don't resolve conflicts in a reasonable period of time, these conflicts tend to escalate even further. They tend to combine. You start to see coalitions of groups who are in contention, and the situation actually becomes consuming to not only the potential but the resources available to the group. And this, again, is a political crisis that tends to diminish the capacity over time of the group to manage the conflicts. And in doing so, decreases the resources available and the interests of the groups. If the group cannot resolve the conflicts, the group tends to fail. And in state failure, you increase the chaos and the anarchy in these systems, and it can overwhelm the system.